Hello, my loves, and welcome back to yet another episode of Strange Playgrounds. Now, as I may have mentioned in a previous episode, I am currently engaged in rereading a lot of series that I love or at least have a connection to that I haven't read for a very long time. In many respects, I've gone right back to the beginning with the Chronicles of Narnia because they weren't the first books that I read, but they were the first real series of books that I remember connecting to as a child. The first real series of books that had a significant impact on the nature of my imagination. And as I believe I may have mentioned in previous episodes, the imagery and the concepts within the Chronicles of Narnia, the themes and concerns crop up again and again and again and again in my own work, in my own imagination. And we're going to go right back to the beginning. I know that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was the first published, and it's also the one that most people read first or were exposed to first, because it's the one that's adapted the most. There's a terrible old cartoon adaptation of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that's absolutely abysmal, that I used to have when I was a very young child, and I loved it back then, but boy howdy does it not stand up now. There's the wonderful BBC adaptation, which is very theatrical, very sort of stage play in both its effect, its acting, its direction, but that kind of works for it. It actually lends it a very peculiarly British charm, I would say. And then there's the film adaptation, which is not very good at all, I've got to say. The big problem with the film adaptation of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is that it's trying to be something else. It was decided by Boardroom because Harry Potter and the Lord of the Rings were successful, and as a result, it's trying to be both of them when it's neither of them. The book is not either The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. It's an entirely different animal. Interestingly, one that has never been adapted is the one that in narrative and chronological terms actually comes first, which is The Magician's Nephew. And The Magician's Nephew it's a very curious book. It's very, very different from most of the others. It's not as grand an adventure, I would say. There isn't as much of an arc in it for the characters, because it isn't really about the characters. That's really what I got from it reading it this time. It's a book of ideas, it's a book of concept. It's not very heavy on plot at all, and it's bisected like right down the middle into two halves. The first half of the book is very much a sort of old-fashioned children's book with a lot of adventure elements where there are characters who discover magic and ways into other worlds and so on and so forth. There's drama between the characters, and then it stops. The story just stops dead at a particular point, and that's when you get what I would call the proselytizing part of the book, which is where Lewis's agenda takes over. And what you have is the formulation of the mythology of Narnia and of the wider metaphysics of this universe, but also a kind of crystallization of what Lewis was trying to do. As we've discussed in previous episodes, I would say he totally failed in that regard. He failed out of a basic misunderstanding of the way his target audience process information, and the way that the minds of young people work, the imaginations of young people work. I read these books a lot when I was a kid, when I was very young. I must have read them before I went to school. Long before I went to school, I read the Chronicles of Narnia. I have a distinct memory, actually, being in my first year at school and reading The Silver Chair, and the teacher coming up to me and asking me questions about it and being very suspicious about the fact I was reading this book and not one of the prescribed books, the sort of colour-coded, the ones that teach you how to read at particular levels that are always very basic stories, and then being put into a specialist sort of classroom whenever reading came up, where I could read whatever the fuck I liked, which was kind of fun. It was kind of interesting. I didn't know why at the time. I had no idea, but that's what happened to me when I was a kid. But reading these books as a child, I had no idea what Lewis was trying to do. I hadn't the context to interpret the metaphors in these stories, so they were just stories to me. Whatever metaphysics the books try to prescribe, they are bounded, or rather, from a child's eyes, they are bounded by the book itself and by the story, by the mythology. We lack the sophistication and the wider context in order to make the analogy. So you don't read the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and say, "Oh, Aslan is a Christ metaphor." You just don't. Oh, and there's the whole thing with the Turkish delight and Edmund is kind of a classic Mephistophelian temptation. You just don't draw those parallels. These are things that occur within the context of the story and the story itself, because children have such an immediate engagement with these things. Once the book is closed, they go away. It's done. The story itself might resonate and it might embed itself subconsciously, but you don't take away the wider ideas. It wasn't until I was a teenager, as most people are, that I started to understand what Lewis was doing, and then I put them away for a long time. But The Magician's Nephew is really interesting. There's a reason it hasn't been adapted, and that's because there's not much to adapt. There just isn't. There's not much that goes on here, really, and yet there's also enormous amounts. The story starts with Polly and Diggory, who are just two children. It's sort of turn of the century. I believe they're in London, although it does. I don't think it specifies. It's just, I think it is London because there are London cabs, and when I say cabs, I don't mean taxis. I mean horse-drawn carriages. So I'd assume it is London. And they meet one another, and Diggory has a mother who's very sick. He's being looked after by his aunt and his Uncle Andrew. And Uncle Andrew is kind of the antagonist of the book for a little while. Uncle Andrew is this very peculiar old gentleman who's kind of supposed to represent science and skepticism, but is this really mean, cruel, small-minded, petty person. And he has found some magical means of travelling between dimensions, basically. These magical rings that he's crafted that allow him to travel between worlds. But he won't go himself. He's too much of a coward. He won't go himself. So he tricks Polly and Diggory into touching the rings and then being flung into this sort of in-between state, which is the wood between worlds. Now, this is an element of the book I really love. I really, really like the metaphysics. This metaphysics that has nothing to do with Aslan, that has nothing to do with gods or creators. It's more pantheistic than anything. It is just a state of being that occurs, and what you have is the wood between the worlds, which is this dreaming, not quite real space where there are pools beneath the trees, and each of the pools leads to a different reality, which is kind of cool. It's a great concept. And it's funny because reading it now and reading back through some of the stuff that I've written, I can see that image, I can see that concept in very transformed terms, but that concept does occur again and again. The sort of liminal space or the in-between space occurs again and again and again. It is really fun. It's really well handled, really well written. And whilst they're there, they actually take it upon themselves to leap into one of the other puddles, which leads to another world, a world called Charn. Now, this is also an area I really like. Charn is this sort of post-apocalyptic world, which is where the White Witch comes from. She's in this book. She's part of a race of giants, which again is part of the sort of biblical imagery coming through, because there's lots of mention of giants, of sort of ancient creatures like giants and whatnot in the Bible. She is from a race of people who basically devastated this world by accessing forbidden magics through their selfishness and so on and so forth. The people of Charn, the remaining ones, are all under some sort of suspension spell. They're basically waiting and preserved until some sorcerer comes along to save their world. And the children end up ringing a bell which breaks the spell, at least for the witch. Her name is Jardis, by the way, and she's not the White Witch yet. She doesn't take on that aspect until The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. She doesn't have like an ice or frost aspect or anything like that. She's very alien, actually, in this book. I like the characterization of Jardis in this book. She's very tall, like impossibly tall, but she's also very physical. She's not like she is in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where she's kind of sedate until the end. She relies on magic more than anything. And in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, in this, she's really physical. She's very strong, very athletic, and she has incredible, incredible, incredible power. She is like an arch sorceress, and it was her apparently that brought about the devastation of this world. And she kind of forces the children to take her back to London at one point. There is a point where she is rampaging around London, and she is literally riding on the back of a horse-drawn carriage, whipping the horses. You know, she is absolutely crazy. Really physical character, really fun. And then the children end up tricking her into going back to the wood between the worlds. And to another reality, one that's only just starting. And this is where you get the story just stops here. The story just goes nowhere after this. It just comes to this thundering halt. And it just becomes a creation myth. That's it. All you get are the characters watching Aslan arbitrarily singing Narnia into being. And it is arbitrary. There's no reason for him to do it. There's no motivation or anything. He just does it arbitrarily. And you get these really weird moments, these very odd moments. I mean, I know that from my readings of Tolkien's life, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were contemporaries, and even friends, in fact. I mean, Treebeard from The Lord of the Rings, if you read the books, Treebeard has this weird sort of verbal tick where he like goes home all the time, really deep in the back of his throat. And apparently that's based on Lewis. Lewis apparently had this really deep, booming voice, and you could hear him coming down the corridors of wherever they studied or taught, you know, this thing. That was Lewis, and that was Treebeard. Tolkien took that concept and put it into Treebeard. But Tolkien was very dismissive. If you read the letters that they shared, Tolkien was immensely dismissive of the Chronicles of Narnia. And reading this one, it's not difficult to see why. It's kind of absurd. There's these unnecessary complications, like Aslan just arbitrarily creates animals that can talk and animals that can't, even if they're of the same species, and you're sort of like, well, what's the point of that? That doesn't make any sense. It makes sense. It's fun on a sort of mythological level, but at the same time, let me get this straight. So you've got these animals that are more intelligent and that are of like human intelligence, and these others that are of the same species but which are like animals. I mean, it's kind of silly. It is kind of silly. And the arbitrary rules that he gives to them, the way they all just sort of fall on their feet and start worshipping him, is really creepy. It's really creepy. They don't owe him anything. This is my problem with this kind of metaphysics. They don't ask to be created. He just arbitrarily creates them for no reason. And then they start worshipping him. It's creepy. It's weird. It's an abusive situation. It's an abusive dynamic, and I don't like it. The sort of natural atheist in me looks at that and thinks, why? You don't owe this guy anything. He arbitrarily foisted consciousness upon you. And that is not a gift. That is not a gift. That is an imposition. If you were not created conscious, you would have no idea, and therefore you wouldn't be open to concepts such as suffering, for example, or the fact of your own mortality, the potential of your own demise and decay. You know, it's a cruel, weird, and arbitrary thing. And also the story itself just suffers immeasurably because there's nothing to do here. The children that have been really active agents up until this point just stop. They just stop and they become witnesses to the apparent miraculousness of Aslan. This is another thing I really dislike from my reading of this half of the book. It's the fact that the characters just comment upon what Aslan is doing. And the book tries to force the reader into interpreting what Aslan is doing as remarkable and wonderful and worthy of praise when it's not really. It's really not. It's actually kind of a cruel and bizarre and weird thing to do. you get the origins here for some of the weirder stuff in the later Narnia books, like the lamppost, for example, that just sprouts arbitrarily from the woods where Lucy passes through the wardrobe. There's no explanation for that in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There is here. The White Witch tore off I think it was part of a lamppost to use as a weapon back in London, and she drops it here, and it takes root and it sprouts. It actually sprouts the lamppost, which is kind of cool, isn't it? Another thing is that that's why the wardrobe leads through to this area, because it's a place where the worlds are thin. It's an open point between our reality and Narnia, which is new at this point. It's new and doesn't have any of it's not quite settled yet. It's still vital and full of the magic of creation, I suppose. It's a nice enough kind of little fantasy mythology, but it does beg a lot of questions. It does beg a lot of questions. And the White Witch loses her agency at this point as well. Jardis loses her agency at this point. She stops being an antagonist and just becomes a nuisance. She just becomes this figure of quite bizarre and just strange antagonism, where she's not the big threat that she was before. She's not this immense physical threat to life and to freedom and to autonomy. She's just a bit of a nuisance at this point. And Aslan, it's very arbitrary. Aslan doesn't just get rid of her. He knows she's an evil influence. He knows she is, and that she brought about the destruction of her own world. He could just get rid of her. Or he could just send her back to Charn. Or he could just plop her in a world where she would be happy, where she would be better than she is now. But he doesn't. He leaves her there, knowing that she'll be back and that she'll cause havoc for the people of Narnia. You know, I have problems with Aslan in this book. I have problems with Aslan in all of the Chronicles of Narnia, I'll be honest. But I have real problems with him in this book and in the last one. I don't understand why he creates Narnia. There's no imperative for him to do so. It's arbitrary. It's just an arbitrary creation. And the fact that it includes conscious creatures makes me a little bit... I don't like it. I really don't like it. What right has he got? What right does Aslan have, even if he has the capacity and the power, to just arbitrarily create consciousness and then to say, now you worship me? It's like, no. No. Absolutely not. There are real problems with it. It's a fun read. It's kind of well written. Some of the characters are fun. I love Uncle Andrew as a character, even though he is kind of a comment upon me, I suppose, in many respects. He's a comment upon my state of mind. You know, the more questioning atheism, those who want to know things, who want to explore things, you know, who want to know why things work and why things are. It is kind of a commentary upon that. You can see Lewis's agenda really clearly in this one. In this one and in the last one more than any of them, you can feel the agenda. And that really makes it suffer, because it starts really well. It's got some great images, great concepts, really quite good characters as well. I love Polly and Diggory. By the way, Polly doesn't really turn up again until the last one, but Diggory does. Diggory is the professor in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is why he takes the stories of Narnia so well and doesn't, like, call out for some sort of child psychologist or whatever. He is Diggory, grown up. But I do... It's interesting reading this book as an adult. It really is, because there are concepts and there are scenes and there are characters that chime really beautifully, and then that make me that place me in the state of mind that I was when I first read it. But then there are others that creep me out, that really creep me out and set my teeth on edge and make me question and question and question. And actually, it's where you can see Lewis coming through. You can actually see the author coming through the characters and through the work, and that makes the work thin. It makes it fragile. It makes it kind of pointless. If he wanted to write a tract, why didn't he write a tract? Don't get me wrong. The books are stronger for having this element in them to a certain degree, because without that element, then they are just kind of flimsy fantasy stories without much weight to them, certainly in comparison to, say, The Lord of the Rings or Gormenghast or the work of Alan Garner, all of which were contemporaneous with this stuff. It's just that the agenda also, it simultaneously strengthens and weakens the stories. And this is an example where it powerfully weakens the end. It powerfully weakens the last third of the book, where it just stops dead. Yeah, it's fascinating. And it's going to be interesting going on from this to read the other Chronicles of Narnia and then his Dark Materials again, which I'm going to do directly after this to compare and contrast them. So, next time, probably not directly after this, I'll probably do another subject in Strange Playgrounds, but straight, we will do The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as the next in this series. Until then, ladies and gents, bye-bye!